Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm very excited to have our guest today. We've been trying to make this happen for a while now, so I'm really glad we're finally having this conversation. Today, we have Dr. Marc Owen Jones, whose work on digital authoritarianism and disinformation, especially as it pertains to Islamophobia, has been illuminating and has helped me personally better understand how narratives are constructed and the harmful consequences of disinformation networks. If you're on Twitter, now X, and you engage with topics of the Middle East, disinformation, discourse, and/or Muslims, I'm sure you've come across a number of his engaging threads on the topic. One being the Southport riots that we had here in the UK. And in that thread, he unraveled the online ecosphere that has played a role in fomenting hatred that often spills out of the digital screen and onto the streets. Additionally, most recently, Mark published a lengthy Substack piece, which we will link in the description box, about Amjad Taha and other Emirati disinformation experts that spread claims of the quote Muslim Brotherhood takeover in Europe, also promote the quote good Muslim, bad Muslim binary, and have most recently tried to downplay the connections between some Emirati individuals and the convicted pedophile Jeffrey Epstein. We have so much to talk about. So glad to have you on our podcast. Welcome to Unpacking Islamophobia, Mark.
No, thank you. It's great to be here finally. Sorry, I
Yes.
realized I just took a drink. I know it's Ramadan. I don't know when this is going out,
Oh,
but
it's fine. It's fine.
okay.
It's fine. We still have to go about as our daily, activity.
I
So it's
know.
all fine. It's
I
all
just
fine.
yeah, okay. It's live in Qatar, so I'm just used to not. I just forgot. I'm stuck in Amsterdam. That's why, FYI.
FYI for everyone. Also, we
Yeah.
should probably say we are recording this. I think it's day 4 or 5 of the current violence in the Middle East with Israel and the US's war on Iran. And Iran has subsequently retaliated, targeting Israel, but also Gulf countries. They say specifically the US bases in the Gulf countries. And Mark is based in Doha, but is currently stuck in Amsterdam due to the current geopolitical situation. Um, I think to start off, given we're talking about disinformation, my first kind of awareness of the term was really in the post-Trump environment. I feel like that is when social media and digital platforms were really being honed by politicians and political campaigns to reach out to voters, to influence voters. So could you define what disinformation is and how does it differ from, say, propaganda or misinformation?
Yeah, so I mean, disinformation, very simply, is the deliberate spread of false information with harmful intent, right? As opposed to misinformation, which is accidentally spreading false information, which many of us do. And I always think the way to remember it is like deliberate, mistake. So mistakenly spreading versus deliberately spreading. And propaganda is propaganda. The problem with propaganda is a really broad term, right? So
Mm,
it's conceptually very difficult to use because some people think propaganda is state-backed information that's meant to persuade people to do things against their own interests. Some think propaganda is any form of persuasion, right? So
mhm.
disinformation is almost always propaganda for sure, but propaganda isn't always false, depending, right? So it's useful to kind of have these different elements of it. And there's also malinformation, which is truthful information that's spread to cause harm, which might be hack and leak operations. So if someone's phone was hacked and their content was used to blackmail them or dox them, that would be malinformation. But yeah, disinformation is perhaps the most interesting in the sense that it's deliberate. So there's people acting with malicious intent to actually spread false information, right? And yeah, I know you said you came back to Trump. There was this renewed interest in the Trump era in the UK. It was like post-Brexit, the rise of
Mm,
social media, algorithmic kind of filtering of information, the decline maybe of traditional news media as gatekeepers, I think
mhm.
led to this situation where we saw this quote unquote information disorder, the proliferation of false information. Although I don't want to get too much in the weeds, but some say this notion of a post-truth age has is overblown.
Yeah.
Though I do believe though that the change in how the digital media ecosystem works has accelerated the pace and
Mhm.
accelerated the means by which people spread information. I also do think the rise of Trump, the rise of the far right has many of them have shown, I think, a disregard for the truth as a value.
Mhm.
And I think we can't dismiss that, right?
Yeah, and I think as you're talking about disinformation and disinformation networks, I mean, what comes to mind for me also is we're often focused on the West, but India plays a really, really massive role in the spreading of disinformation, and
Mm,
they have entire, party-led IT cells that's pump out information. They have bots, but also in a lot of the context of say like big political events or even geopolitical events, say the genocide in Gaza, say the Mamdani
mm.
election, you had voices from India influencing what was or putting in narratives into these ecosystems. So it just shows you how it's not limited to one country or one area. It's
Yeah.
transnational, it's international, it's a global sort of phenomenon that we're entering and we're experiencing.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, do you mean disinformation generally or Islamophobic disinformation?
I think generally, but primarily what comes from India is a lot of Islamophobic.
Yeah, I think there was actually a study that demonstrated that the most Islamophobic online content did come from India.
Yeah.
I can't remember who conducted the study, but there was one done, and yes, and it makes sense given the rise of Hindutva there, Modi, Indian
Hmm.
nationalists, Hindu nationalists,
Hmm.
and this kind of infrastructure of troll farms that seem to be endemic there and attached to political parties, right? And I do
Yes.
think a lot of the expertise there then gets mobilized around others. I mean, I wrote a piece at the beginning of the genocide, the Israeli genocide in Gaza, about the role of Indian accounts spreading, pro-Israeli
Hmm.
disinformation. So,
Hmm.
and often Islamophobic at the same time.
Yes. Yeah. Um, well, going on to another piece that
Mm,
you published, this was in July 2024 with Sohan D'Souza. You published the
mm,
lengthy report titled The Qatar Plot, which what you uncovered was a massive shadowy social media operation funded by dark money to spread
mm.
far-right narratives on immigration, Islam, and Israel's genocide in Gaza across the globe, but in particular this operation was focused on Europe. Can you describe this plot a bit, the key players, and the narratives they promoted?
Yeah, so really interesting case study. And I should add that Sohan and I have believed that, or almost certain that this plot has started again, right? So this campaign is actually kicked off again, right? Which is maybe maybe for part two of this podcast. Uh, but yeah, the key players. So just to put it in context, we're talking about a multi-million-dollar influence campaign that involves hate speech, mainly against Muslims and immigrants. But there was also a component targeting Lebanon and targeting Hezbollah and the so-called axis of evil, Iran and Hezbollah and I think the Houthis. But what essentially this campaign was, a large part of it was on social media. So they were running ads on Meta, Facebook ads, basically. These ads were being, targeted to people across the EU, France, England, Germany, Croatia, Belgium, like it was all over the place, right? We calculated at least, and this was based on an absolute minimum, 40 million views, when in reality that number was much higher because what we know is that the cost of the Facebook ads alone was $1.2 million, right? Which would get you way more than
Hmm.
40 million views, right? This was huge, and Facebook didn't actually publish how many views the campaign got because Facebook don't want to admit to that kind of information. And I'll also speak more about what Facebook did and did not say because I think it's really relevant to Islamophobia and the role of big tech in this. But yes, this campaign was mostly it was Facebook ads, it was YouTube ads, it was paid X ads, it was promoted content on TikTok. I'm trying to give a scale of it, and it wasn't just social media ads. There was a quote unquote offline aspect of this. They ran ads in Times Square. They ran ad at CPAC just before Donald Trump spoke. So CPAC is a conservative conference that's become increasingly popular as the far right have got more popular. And they created fake NGOs. They appeared at protests with the content from this campaign. And yeah, they even created like a fake NGO that put out a petition that real people signed, So during this whole thing, we actually contacted change.org where the petition was to ask if this NGO is real, and Change.org took down the petition, right? But there was real people signing it. There was people filming videos of themselves, encouraging other people to sign it, right? Mostly Americans. And so, this campaign did target the US as well. But the narratives were the most disturbing, right? So, across all these, I mean, I should add as well that the social media part of this campaign, what was interesting about it is that it would create what looked like multiple different groups with different branding, right? So, you'd have one page that would be like, um, called, or one group that was called like La Projet, like the project, or the Qatar Plot, or one group would be called, Shame on Qatar. Another group might be called, You Have the Power, and it was directed at Sheikh Moza. Uh, I'll explain why Qatar was relevant here. But the reason we called it the Qatar Plot is because the whole narrative of this campaign, across all the different bits of content, was the same. It was that Qatar had the power to do a number of things. It had the power to release the Israeli hostages, which again is a bizarre notion. But the most disturbing aspect of this Qatar, campaign, where hate speech came in and Islamophobia came in, was that Qatar was orchestrating essentially the Muslim takeover of Europe, of Western Europe. Okay, and so much of the content was about was videos or images of migrants either engaging in or being accused of engaging in crime, criminality, murder, violence, or rape, and saying that the presence of them was due to Qatar orchestrating this, right? And you'd have content like things saying like 60 million Muslims in Europe. This is not an accident. This is part of the Qatar plot. Or terror cells in Europe, Muslim terror cells in Europe. This is not an accident. This is part of the Qatar plot. And so what this really was is a play on some very well, the well-known kind of blood libel and great replacement theories, right? Where so great replacement theory is the notion, I'm sure your listeners are fairly familiar, that white people are going to be replaced by people of color due to immigration and intermarriage, etc. But in this particular case, it was that Western civilization, or at least European civilization, was going to be replaced or displaced by unfettered immigration, but particular Muslim immigration to Europe, right? It ties in with all these very, very toxic, racist, Islamophobic narratives from the far right in Europe. The role of Qatar in this is somewhat perplexing in many ways to some people, but I think I mean, this was at the time of, post-genocide, right? So Qatar was playing a mediating role, but there's been lots of information campaigns involving Qatar, and I think I'm cynical. I think, in a way, the Qatar thing is not the most important aspect of this. I think the Qatar mention gives political cover to a hate speech campaign, and I think it's easier for journalists or people looking into this to dismiss what is really a virulent campaign of discrimination by saying, well, it's a political thing against Qatar. Who cares about Qatar? So yeah, that's the broad strokes. The key actors involved. Well, one, we don't know who paid for this, right? And this is it's actually more interesting that we don't know in a way. We know that there is at least a connection to Johnny Moore. Johnny Moore
Okay.
being, well, he was head of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation again, which I think most people know was the organization set up to provide aid to people in Gaza, but that was also basically a death site where people trying to get aid were shot, and there's even some suggestions that they were complicit in war crimes. A really terrible organization. But Johnny Moore has a PR company called JDA Worldwide, and we found two components of this campaign that were attached to him. So he'd been giving people, for example, Katrina Lantos Sweat, who was at this I think it was called the Interfaith Conference or something, IRF, International Religious Freedom Conference in 2024. And she was holding up one of these bits of like one of the branding things from one of these Facebook groups. And so we asked her, well, we worked with the journalist Anna Chopra at AFP at the time, and we asked him to ask her where she got that. And she said, I wasn't involved in this campaign. It was given to me by Johnny Moore. And then when we asked Johnny Moore, he was like, he stopped answering. Then there was another really bizarre aspect of this campaign where they filmed like a weird stunt at a mall in Atlanta, right, in Georgia. And in the campaign, they'd hired two former beauty pageant models. I mean, it's so weird, the story. But from I think it was Miss Tennessee and Miss Mississippi. I might have got my states wrong, from 2015 and 2020. And they basically made them up to look like they'd been beaten up. And this was on International Women's Day. I think it was time to be that. And then they had Sheikha Moza, who is the mother of the Qatari Emir, dressed in one of her like well-known like blue dresses. chain, and she was holding them by a chain and dragging them around this mall. And they did like this talk outside Valentino, the fashion brand, because Valentino is owned by a Qatari investment firm, basically saying that she doesn't care about women. And yeah, and
Mm,
the press release for that campaign was also published by JDA Worldwide, Johnny Moore's PR company, right? So the two clear connections we got to this campaign were to Johnny Moore, who has been a long-time advocate of normalization between the Gulf states and Israel. Um, and there's a connection between him and Amjad Taha that we can talk about later. But
mm,
yeah, so that was that connection, which is very strange. Um, but Facebook, and this is what's really bizarre. So we did this investigation, as you mentioned, and we published it, I think, back in July 2024.
mm,
And at the same time we were doing this, Facebook were looking into this network, Facebook. Every quarter or so, they will publish what is like a transparency report where they document what they call coordinated and authentic behavior, which is essentially like when people manipulate Facebook. So state-backed disinformation, as an example. And we created this really detailed report, like 100 pages of stuff. We put all the content out there. Facebook's report is literally a page and a half, right? And there's two crucial things about the report. They did not mu they did not mention the most important part of this campaign. They mentioned countries like Qatar, it was targeting the EU or European Union, but they did not mention once the word Islamophobia or anti-Muslim hate speech, right? And they also attributed the campaign. So by attribution, I mean they said who was behind it. And what they said was Vietnam, and which is nonsense. I mean, it's obviously nonsense for an audience. Like, one, we know Vietnam has no real beef with with Qatar or Muslims, at least that I'm aware of. But we knew the Vietnam connection because actually we knew that the infrastructure for the Facebook infrastructure of this campaign was run by a sort of digital shop in Vietnam. We'd found that out. That was clear, and this is not uncommon. So
mm,
whoever's running this operation was like reached out to this guy in Vietnam who had a service where he would basically say, I've got loads of Facebook pages and I can run ads and I can game the Facebook system. Here's my services. Because we even reached out to him and we spoke to him, or the Anuj spoke to him, and we asked him who paid for the campaign, and he says, I just got a message on Telegram. We don't know if he's lying, but also it's possible because in this day and age, you could just reach out to someone who's offering dodgy services on Telegram and not tell you
yeah.
why does he need to know who you are? And then pay all these things, right? So Facebook were dishonest, in my opinion, about who was behind it. They were also played down the significance of the hate speech in the campaign. And yeah, they didn't provide much information about the extent or scale of the campaign. But
Mm.
what we do believe, it was an anti-Muslim campaign, anti-immigrant campaign that was probably one of the largest operations, at least on Facebook, run by some entity, we don't know, but certainly Johnny Moore's company and Johnny Moore participated in this campaign.
Wow, there are so many parts to this campaign. And like I had mentioned in the beginning, where it's not just online, you just mentioned multiple
Mm.
incidences where it was in person, it was like actually happening in real life. And so it was all
Yeah,
coordinated. I didn't know about the Times Square um,
yeah.
billboard. No idea about that. I do remember
Well, yeah.
at the
Sorry,
time.
sorry. I'm just saying, yeah, we like linking all these things together was sometimes a bit of skill, but some luck and timing, but it was crazy.
Yeah, and also just, I mean, for me, I'm just thinking about a big board of like connecting the dots and trying to seeing all of them connect, and it's so confusing. But also, I
Mm.
remember seeing some of these posts online, especially the ones targeting Sheikh Moza, and it's
Mm.
very random. It wasn't like a natural sort of, uh, I don't know, a discourse that comes about, but it was very random in the time that it came about and the way, because largely when I follow conversations on the Middle East or Islam, Muslims, so on and so forth, which is the work I do, Sheikha Moza doesn't appear. Qatar might appear, but Sheikha
Yeah.
Moza herself doesn't appear. So it was
Mm.
very strange for individuals and profiles who I was thinking you probably don't even know who she is, or you can't even name where Qatar is on the map.
Right.
Talking about her and saying that she was responsible for again, she had the power to bring the Israeli hostages back, and she wasn't doing it because s- larger issues, blah blah blah, whatever. But
Mm,
you also mentioned that the narratives I was promoting were very much so about like the great replacement conspiracy theory. And the
mm,
reason I think to point out to our audience why that is important to note is that those threads of that conspiracy theory and threads alluding to this sort of stuff are common in our politics today. Here in the UK, we have reform. Reform's big thing is stopping Muslim immigrants or also wanting to deport Muslims who live in the country, who've been citizens,
mm.
creating an ICE-style deportation force that they want to bring about. And reform promotes this sort of rhetoric as well in terms of that demographically, quote unquote, white people are under threat from Muslims, immigrants, people of color.
Yeah.
So a lot of times these disinformation networks, I don't know if like it starts there or if it's kind of they're cross-pollinating where they feed off narratives that already exist in society, or they're injecting new narratives into that and new sort of theories. But yeah, it is very interesting to see the stuff we see online being repeated by politicians and political organizations on the ground, and vice versa, I think.
And transnationally, and I think that's one
Yes.
really interesting comment. Like you said, you mentioned the UK, we're talking about the US, but you'll start to see these really interesting transnational lines, like, hearing the Israeli Ministry of Diaspora Affairs, Amichai Chikli, or I don't know how to pronounce his surname, talking about Sadiq Khan of London,
Yes.
because
Yeah.
Trump's talking about Sadiq Khan of London, and you'll have someone in obviously you'll have Tommy Robinson and Nigel Farage talking about Sadiq Khan of London, and
Yeah.
so people around the world talking about the mayor of London.
Yeah.
Why? Well,
And
because he's
yeah.
Muslim, right? And then you'll have now these fake narratives of how you get stabbed in London because of all the immigrants, which is the opposite of what's true because London's safer. So
Yeah.
there's this kind of transnationalization of not just Islamophobia. We know that, and but like you said, there's these quite specific narratives that have
Yes.
transnationalized, right?
And I think you mentioned Sadiq Khan. Another one was Mamdani's election
Yes,
and campaign. That was huge. You had politicians from around the globe talking about Mamdani, and he's the mayor of New York City. Why are politicians in Hungary talking about the new mayor of New York? And yeah, it just shows you just how interesting this online ecosystem is
yeah,
and the topics that they pick up. And a lot of it does have to do with a lot of these individuals are also known to use anti-Muslim discourse, use Islamophobic stereotypes and tropes. Whether they hold anti-Muslim prejudice or they're using it for political gain, whatever it may be, they do utilize it.
yeah.
Um,
I mean, the intention is almost not relevant because the
mhm.
impact is the
The impact.
communication of that narrative, right?
Yeah,
And any
exactly.
Muslim in a position of power. I mean, we see attacks on Ilhan Omar as,
Yes,
Rashid Tlaib,
yes,
in part because they're Muslim, in part because they're pro-Palestinian, or in
yes.
Ilhan's case, she has Somali roots. So any
Mhm.
Muslim in a position of power in the West, whether it's Mamdani or Ilhan Omar and Sadiq Khan, basically become targets, right, of
Targets.
this
And that
campaign.
goes right into my next question.
Mm,
In my research on Islamophobia, I've consistently seen, and this is what we're talking about, how politically active Muslims in the West are smeared with allegations of being linked to the quote Muslim Brotherhood.
right.
And that's a charge often used to delegitimize and with the intent to criminalize Muslim civic engagement. And it goes back decades. It's not
Mm,
something new. My work here at Bridge, we've seen it for decades. I mean, some of the earliest time I can think of this being a big story was in 2012 when Huma Abedin, who was the aide to Hillary Clinton at the time, she was
mm,
publicly accused of being part of the Muslim Brotherhood, without evidence, obviously.
right.
What's striking is that these similar narratives are now being used online by a
Mm,
network of Emirati linked social media personalities. And you go into this in your
right.
Substack investigation, specifically with figures like Amjad Taha, and the broader disinfluencer ecosystem. And they all appear to be focused on spreading conspiracy theories about the Muslim Brotherhood, Islamization, and the harms of immigration apparently in Europe. Um,
Hmm.
in your deep dive of Amjad Taha, you describe him as part of this broader ecosystem. Who are the other key actors and how coordinated is there like messaging? How coordinated does it appear to be? Is it more organic or do you see links in terms of what they're posting and the topics they're discussing.
Yeah, so the coordination between Amjad Taha's narrative and those goes across several levels, right? So, they cross promote each other extensively. So Amjad will retweet that group of people the most. They will retweet him the most. He's the most influential connection between these people. But what's crucial, they all set up their X accounts at the same time, more or less, December 2024. This was the same months that about three or four fake news organizations, like these fake news websites, I say fake news, they were like pseudo news, right? They had editors. They were all registered around that time. And they all started tweeting around that time using identical narratives about the Muslim Brotherhood, using identical uh, content styles, filming these kind of two video explainers in the same
Mhm.
studio. And crucially, Amjad Taha's company, Crestnax Media, um, paid. So he paid for advertising. You can see it on Google Ad for these two pseudo news sites. One's called the Washington Eye and one's called Daily Eurotimes, which again are nominally independent. Then they don't show any connection to each other. But they are the ones that this disinfluencer network write articles on, and they will set up at the same time, right? So Amjad connects them in all these different ways, and the narrative is identical. They all push out the same narratives, right? Which is, I mean, they talk about many things aligned with the Emirati foreign policy, but the most common word, I downloaded all the timelines for these disinfluencers. The most common collocation, so more than one word together, is Muslim Brotherhood.
Mhm.
So literally their timelines are dedicated to writing about the Muslim Brotherhood, right? So the sort of belief is, and with a high degree of confidence, is that Amjad and his company Crestnax Media are coordinating this group of disinfluencers, which I use to describe influencers who spread disinformation or hate speech. Um, and it's part of they're made to look independent. They're nominally independent, but they're actually coordinated, right? So it's a new form of personality-driven information operation, right? Instead of creating loads of bots or trolls, you create what look like authentic individuals spreading this information. And the craziest bit that really links this together, I should say, is that I think 7 or 8 of them have all published books. And all of those books were published within 3 months of one another with the same publisher, and also the same publisher that Amjad Taha published his book on. Um, and I think it's a good indication of who Amjad Taha is because he wrote a book in 2000, I think 16, and it was about the Arab Spring, the Arab uprisings, and how Iran was behind everything and orchestrating everything. And then he updated this book in 2024, kept the same title, the same cover, but his argument shifted. So it was no longer Iran that was behind everything. It was the Muslim Brotherhood, right? So he literally changed his argument. Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, this is this group. And they like retweet Tommy Robinson as well, which is
Yeah.
just wild.
Yeah.
Because Tommy Robinson is literally an anti-Muslim activist, right?
That's his entire personality. That's what he's
Exactly.
made his career off of, is just being Islamophobic and very racist, and also just
Right.
being completely erratic and have so many criminal convictions. But apart
Yeah.
from that, I think one of the other interesting thing whenever I come across these disinfluencers profiles on Twitter,
Mm,
just I read their stuff and I'm observing because I find it so interesting and the sorts of
mm,
claims that they make. Um,
mm.
that they often use the good Muslim, bad Muslim binary of we are the
Right.
good Muslims, we are tolerant, we are open-minded, we are progressive. Look at the Bay, we welcome everyone.
Mm,
Um, whereas Muslims in Europe and Muslims in the US, especially those who are politically active, are the
mm.
dangerous ones. I think
Yeah.
there's one that they constantly promote this video. I don't know if it was a Emirati like government official who
Yeah.
talks
Yeah.
about that the threat will of radical Islam will come from Europe and not the Middle
Mm.
East if these governments don't tackle their Muslim populations.
Yeah.
Um, and that is very, I think because it's coming from individuals who identify as Muslims, who,
Mm.
if it's a female disinfluencer, she's wearing a hijab,
Mhm.
they almost give Islamophobia a veneer of acceptability because, oh, it's coming from a Muslim person.
Yeah.
Surely you can't spread Islamophobia if you're Muslim.
Well, this is the kind of the kind of the thing that those right-wing people desire most is the
Mhm.
Muslim that they can wheel out who hates on other Muslims, right? The visibly presenting Muslim who that they can say, look, a Muslim talking about Muslims and criticizing them. We're not racist.
Yeah.
The Muslims saying it, you know. I mean, I think the best part of, I mean, the best part in the sense, the kind of comeuppance of this is when Amjad Taha went onto GB News, which is a right-wing British news outlet, made some false claims about Islamic Relief Worldwide, the charity funding
Mm.
terror, and then as a result of his comments, GB News got sued because it was false information, right? But
Mm.
you could tell GB News, you know, again, rolled him out because he was the opportunity to say, look, we got a Muslim talking how Muslim immigration's bad. We're not
Yeah.
racist.
Yeah. And that seems to be a a common theme here, and I'm going to bring it back to UK politics because
Mm,
we have individuals, um, South Asian in ethnic background, who have attained positions of power, but then have used their identity as South Asians. I'm referencing Suella Braverman, I'm referencing
yeah,
Sajid Javed, I'm referencing Shabana Mahmood, who now push for really restrictive and harmful immigration policies. And it's almost as if um, other members of their parties can say, "Well, look, I'm not racist or I don't hold any prejudice." These individuals themselves are saying that we should be doing having these policies. So yeah, it almost becomes like a shield to
yeah,
protect themselves from any sort of accusations of racism and Islamophobia.
yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, absolutely. You know, and I think, I mean, again, just one thing I want to, because that link with the right is really important. One thing I did want to mention about the disinfluencer network and Amjad Taha, which I think is really relevant, is the overlap that that network has with right-wing news sites, particularly Visegrad 24, which some of you may know, which is, I would argue, an anti-Islam disinfluencer account. I mean, it's a news aggregator run out of Poland by some guy called Stefan Thompson. And, you know, it was one of those accounts, every time there was some, you know, event or stabbing or shooting or incident in Europe or anywhere, it would just instantly say that the perpetrator was Muslim without any evidence, right? And that now had it created a Middle East site called Middle East 24, and all the disinfluencers were also posting content on there and having that retweet their content. And then in Intelligence Online, which is kind of like a security focused sort of website where people submit sort of articles that, you know, where they've got information, you know, secret, not secret information necessarily, maybe secret, but they said that they'd seen documents, I think, from the UAE Ministry of Foreign Affairs where it talked about the possibility of collaborating with Visegrad 24, right? So there is this now, you know, sort of concrete link, at least saying that Visegrad 24 had made contact or that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the UAE had contact with Visegrad 24 and it explored the possibility and acknowledge that Visegrad 24 might be a good outlet for UAE's foreign policy or it's spreading its message abroad, which is wild when you think about it, right? You have this fervently far-right anti-Islam account, European-based social media news outlet potentially collaborating with this UAE-based network, and you have this really interesting overlap now between quote-unquote anti-Muslim Brotherhood, anti-Islamist narratives
Mhm.
between unabashed Islamophobic narratives, right? And that continuum, you know, that distinction is not going to be something that many people make.
Yeah.
Um, and you know, this is what's super harmful is that it's blowing the lines. And I think this Muslim Brotherhood is narrative is often just a way of disguising Islamophobic narratives as well. You
Yeah.
know, say, oh, what the Muslim Brotherhood of that? Like, what do you actually mean by that? Does the average
Yeah.
Joe know what you're talking about? And
Yeah.
even I,
And
who know what the Muslim Brotherhood is, doesn't know really what you're talking about when you
yeah,
criticize.
yeah.
You know?
And we see this so much in US politics as well. We've seen in
Mm,
Texas right now, it's been a huge thing with the primaries, where Republican officials have basically, welcomed back their Islamophobic rhetoric after doing the whole border wall thing, which now
mm,
no longer is salient. So they're like, okay, we'll go back to our Islamophobic tropes because they always do it for us. And they've been promoting. I mean, the governor of Texas banned the Muslim Brotherhood and is going after the Council of American Islamic Relations, which is the
mhm.
largest American Muslim civil rights organizations, accusing them of being Muslim Brotherhood. It's often used just as a cover to go after often Muslim political participation. And the whole thing is, you have when Muslims participate. they're accused of being sectarian or having ulterior motives or a foreign infiltration. When you don't have Muslims participate, you're accused of living in parallel societies and not wanting to
Mm.
join wider society. So
Right.
it's
Multiculturalism has failed, you know.
yeah, so it's you can see how these play out in a number of ways, and again, you can see how they play out in both the U.S. and Europe as well. You were talking about the UAE and connections to far-right media networks. To what extent is there evidence that this online campaign with Amjad Taha is connected to or aligned with the Emirati government's political agenda? And why would the UAE have an interest in promoting the Muslim Brotherhood conspiracy narrative in Western societies?
Yeah, well, I think this is the big question, and I think even maybe the latter one you might know more based on your research. But firstly, there's no smoking gun that links Amjad Taha to the Emirati government or this campaign to the Emirati government. However, having said that, we know that there are some documents now at least linking or at least talking about potential connection between Visegrad 24 and the UAE government, and Visegrad 24 seems to be have some relationship with Amjad Taha's network, which I'll just leave that for that for now. But also, Amjad Taha talks about himself as an Emirati citizen, right? Which is interesting because he's not Emirati ethnically. He lived in Britain for a long time, and he that means he was given Emirati citizenship, which is a very hard thing to get for one. It's usually as a service or reward or some other thing. And crucially, whatever he's doing, which again is getting a lot of international attention. I mean, he's getting sued, well, he's getting channel sued abroad. He's taking these trips. I mean, I should have mentioned that these disinfluencers, they're going on trips to universities in Oxford, Cambridge, Georgetown, in the US, along with Ed Hussein, by the way, which is quite interesting. Um, he often shows face there. And there's also a photo of Johnny Moore with Amjad Taha I think and at one of these events at Georgetown, right? So they know each other, which again is interesting. But the UAE would definitely you can't do anything in the UAE. I mean, like now they're threatening to fine social media users for spreading false information about the war, right? You can't do anything like this in the UAE without the government knowing and approving, right? Influencers need licenses to operate. So this is the government. I'm not saying necessarily they pay for it, although I'm sure that they are somehow, but they're condoning it because it's not being allowed to happen, right? It's not a subtle campaign, and these are Emirati citizens participating in it, right? And so that's really important. And also, we know from previous research, there was that campaign where the UAE government contracted out, I think it was Alp Services, which is a Swiss company, which was paid to essentially, create an anti-Muslim Brotherhood campaign in Europe, right?
Mhm.
So we know that there's precedent here. So the shoe definitely fits. The why of it, well, on a Muslim Brotherhood level, yes, the Emirati government fear political Islam. Um, this is no secret, especially after the Arab Spring, where the Muslim Brotherhood arguably was successful getting, elected in Egypt. But it's this notion that I think the Gulf monarchies more broadly always worry about the potential for social and societal change. This is why they're not democracies. They know they probably would not win an election. And I think they fear their biggest opponent or rivalry would be Islamism or the Muslim Brotherhood. And I think what's really crucial here, especially in the UAE, is that they've normalized with Israel, which is like the least popular thing that you can do, right? And then there was October the 7th, which again prompted a renewed wave of pro-Palestinian sentiment. So you have a government in the UAE who is actively, in many ways, going against the desires of its population on a deep ideological level. And I think they fear that that is also going to be basically fueling discontent and fueling a desire of people maybe to join Islamist parties, right? So they have this long-standing fear that I think has got much worse since October the 7th and since they normalized in about 2020, I think it was. So that's really key. Um, why they want to do it in Europe? Well, I think there's a number of reasons. I mean, there's this opportunity now for Muslim Brotherhood to be sort of banned in multiple countries or deemed a terrorist organization. That would be very beneficial for the UAE in terms of their ability to transnationalize their war on Islamism. And there's also another thing. I mean, I think generally the UE are probably more aligned with the right-wing parties in Europe, right? And so this is also feeding into their narratives. Um, so what I see this as a form of electoral interference. I think these campaigns essentially work to promote the far right in Europe. But I don't know. Like sometimes I'm myself am surprised by how much this campaign is verging into straight Islamophobia, and and I don't think the UAE government particularly care necessarily about what happens to Muslims outside the UAE, but I don't know. I struggle to kind of reconcile this campaign emanating from the UAE that
Mm.
is very harmful to Muslims. And this is where I mean you probably know far more about that than me. And I do think there's also this collaboration, this I suppose the relationship with Israel, the normalization is also indicative of a different relation to perhaps religion than many possibly. And also we have to see the synergies here, right? These campaigns are a confluence of, we talked about India, but the evangelicals in the
Yes.
US, the likes of Johnny Moore, Israel. I mean, one of the campaigns that I investigated in 2024 was one of the ones that we attributed, or was attributed not by me, but I mean, I worked on uncovering this disinformation campaign and hate speech campaign. It was attributed to the Israeli Ministry of Diaspora Affairs. We know that they paid a Tel Aviv-based company to spread to campaign against UNRWA, but also, and by doing so, also tried to provoke race relations in the UK by dividing African American support for Palestinians away from that movement, and crucially, spreading the same kind of anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant narratives that we've seen in these campaigns. And that was attributed. We know Israel do that tactically. They always try to position themselves as this protector of Western civilization from the barbarian hordes of the East. But we know that that government is actually doing these campaigns, right?
Hmm.
And that kind of weird alignment now between evangelicals, the UAE, Israel is like an interesting intersection of slightly different agendas, right? UAE,
Yeah.
Muslim Brotherhood, Israel, anti-Islam, evangelicals, anti-Islam, but I don't know, from a more religious perspective. So it's a
Yeah.
really kind of strange mix. India,
A
yeah, they've got
strange
their own issues.
dynamic. Yeah, and India, I don't know that they're also part of it, but don't really
Yeah,
understand. And I think they utilize it to further their own ideological basis of creating India as a Hindu-only nation,
right.
um, as being and kicking out Muslims or deporting them or rendering them second-class citizens. But you mentioned Operation Luxor, and I think it's just to give our audience a brief overview of that. It was a New Yorker piece uncovered it, talking about how the Emiratis paid a private Swiss firm called Alp Services to basically create a roster of Muslim individuals and organizations in Europe, and smear them as being tied to the Muslim Brotherhood. Bridge's very own senior research fellow, Dr. Farid Hafiz, was targeted. He was in Austria, Austrian citizen, and police forces went after him. No one was actually charged with anything. No one was convicted. The operation was largely just aimed to smear and delegitimize, especially Muslim political participation and just Muslim community organizing in Europe. And the fallout from that was it was huge because they also tried to go after, they did go after the largest, I believe, Islamic charitable organization, Islamic Relief, um, accusing them of being, quote, Muslim Brotherhood as well. So you see how, again, online campaigns have real world consequences and harms and cause immense pain for individuals, but also lead to violence on the streets, as we saw with Southport.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. And
yeah,
much of the disinformation there, I mean, yes, it was real people, but a lot of it came from an anonymous account called Europe Invasion, and we still
yeah,
don't know. And by we, I mean the world, apart from who ran it, doesn't know who's behind it,
yeah.
you know, which is wild.
And that's the other thing is that staying anonymous also
Yeah.
plays a role in giving individuals the ability to just post whatever they want,
Yeah.
um, and protecting their identities in the
Yeah.
process.
And that anonymity as well, and in this case, anonymity to these influential hate speech accounts is also a product of the ideology or the oligarch ideology of someone like Elon Musk, who
Mm.
himself has retweeted and promoted these anti-Muslim accounts. Um,
He
so,
has been
like,
he's been
Yeah.
very central to a lot of the very extreme conversations that have been happening here in the UK about immigration,
Yeah. Well,
about Muslims.
retweets Amjad
Uh,
Taha now. So.
it all comes back around. It's a
Yeah.
full circle.
But they're all
Um,
like bedfellows, you know.
Yeah, so I know we've been speaking for a while, and this has been
Sorry, yeah. I've been talking
such
too
an
much.
important conversation. But so my last question is, looking ahead, how might this landscape evolve as digital platforms, AI, and international geopolitics continue to shift? And we are currently in the midst of this major shift that's happening. Do you foresee UAE-linked influence operations growing more sophisticated? And what does that mean for Islamophobic discourse in European or Western politics?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of this is tied to political regulatory environments. And I do think we are seeing the rise of the right again in a place that perhaps we didn't see before. We're seeing people like Elon Musk with his right-wing views, having control, algorithmic control over a very large platform. We're seeing social media companies in general renege on their responsibilities to moderate content after Donald Trump got elected. And we're seeing this kind of selective enforcement of First Amendment rights in a ways that essentially privilege right-wing voices and anti-Muslim voices. Um, so, I think the direction of travel is not looking good. And I think, if a state wants to capitalize and use their wealth and resources, such as the UAE or Israel, to try and influence the discussion and the public sphere in Europe, that they can, and not just Europe, I mean the US and elsewhere. And so I do see it playing out that way because I think there is very little to stop them. And this is what worries me, and I worry we'll get to this critical mass now. I think what bothers me about, I mean, a lot bothers me, but these Islamophobic campaigns, I'm not an expert on Islamophobia. I mean, but I do know that there's people who are Islamophobic. You get the liberal Islamophobia and the illiberal Islamophobia, right? So people who might be Islamophobic because of, they see that as intolerant towards, say, LGBTQ rights or other things, and just, the classics who think they're going to enforce Sharia law on everyone. These campaigns, like they appeal to both, right? So they're sort of agnostic. They'll just put every narrative in there, right? So, I just feel like they can appeal to a broader array of people. And my worry is that these kind of campaigns are going to fuel and are fueling a kind of, and I worry they'll reach a critical mass where there's actually, I mean, I know there is danger of being in a minority in any country, but in Europe, and I just worry it's going to get much worse.
Mhm.
Um, because nothing's stopping. What's stopping any of these?
Yeah.
Like legislation is so poor, and the current US administration, where most of these big tech companies are based, is actually pressuring the EU, it's pressuring the UK politically to actually not have rules and regulations that govern what is said online and these social media companies, right? So there is a lot of things to be worried about in terms of this war of narratives and these state-backed information operations that use Islamophobia. And I'm making an argument. The reason I'm in Amsterdam is I was at a workshop talking about this, and I'm sort of arguing, anti-Islam narratives or Islamophobia or anti-Muslim narratives, they form a place where people from with slightly different geopolitical objectives can actually come together. And so it
Yeah.
is the Islamophobia that is the shared substrate, the shared
Hmm.
ideology that binds Israel with the evangelicals, with the UAE, with India, right? So they might
Hmm.
have slightly different objectives, but the Islamophobia unites them. And if they're all pouring different campaigns that share that same thread, that's a lot of resources going to this hateful ideology.
Yeah. That has had grave consequences, definitely in at least the past two
Mm,
decades.
mm,
It's played a role in the genocide in Gaza. It's played a role in the China's campaign against Uyghur Muslims. So
yeah.
it's again, we talk about it's global, it's transnational, and unfortunately, the problem continues to grow, especially as we have more right-wing and far-right governments coming into power. I think everything that you said, I keep thinking about reform here in the UK and the narratives that they bring forth, the um, sort of their main policy has been to promote Islamophobia. It hasn't been in terms of addressing the actual issues that
Mm,
British UK citizens are facing, but it's been very much so to scapegoat Muslims again and use them as a scapegoat in terms of addressing actual problems on the ground. But thank you again for this very interesting, and I think our viewers will really enjoy listening to this conversation. We went into so many different deep dives, so I really appreciate you taking the time out and speaking with us today. We will be linking your Substack pieces and the Qatar Plot one in the description box, so I urge everyone to check those out and do follow Mark on social media. He does great threads, like I've always said. I find them very, very interesting. Yeah, thank you everyone for listening. Thank you, Mark, for joining us. And tune in to the next episode.
Thank you. It's been great. Thanks for having me.